What I'm presenting today are just partial and preliminary findings of data that we've collected over the last 4 or 5 months, mainly speaking to a survey, the findings that we've received from a survey, and supplementing that with impressions from field work that we've done as well. But just to emphasise that I'm giving you a glimpse only of the findings, and there's much more to be unpacked in the coming weeks, in fact. So this research we're conducting, and the we is Kira Clark from University of Melbourne and Kitty Terrell from VU. And Kira, you probably know of, has got an extensive research background on low SES students in vet-in schools especially, but also prior to that, the assistance that's given to apprentices. Kitty's background is on those young people who become disaffected with secondary schooling, drop out of secondary schooling, and our interests overlap to the extent that we're both now concerned with those second chance programs that kids find themselves in once they've either been expelled from or exited from secondary schools. And those programs, interesting to the extent also that they're the students in those 15 to 19-year-olds, often who have experienced quite a bit of hardship, have got one foot in a year 11 and 12 mainstream curriculum setting and one foot in a vet setting as well. And we're very interested to see how young people adapt when they're in the vet setting. And in fact, this research came about largely because of the comments and feedback I was getting from young people in such second chance programs who would say quite surprising things about their RTO, the settings, counterintuitive to me at least, and that set off a process where we wanted to explore exactly where kids feel comfortable, where they don't feel comfortable, where they thrive and where they don't. So I'll just cover the purpose of it there. The research is, as I say, based heavily on a survey that went out, a 32-question survey that went out to those private for-profit training organisations that we identified had quite an enrolment, over 100 students, 15 to 19-year-olds, who hadn't attained, or whose highest attainment was year 11. We've also, in parallel with that, we're doing field work in 3 states, that's Victoria, South Australia and Queensland, with in-depth interviewing of 2 RTOs in each state and stakeholder peak bodies and the like that have some insight into 15 to 19-year-olds. Now we chose Queensland, Victoria and South Australia because each had very similar incentive schemes. In the Victorian case, the Victorian Training Guarantee, the Cert 3 guarantee in Queensland and Skills for All in South Australia. So we were trying to find like with like there. In terms of the context, we've got running through this whole research experience is consideration of the major systemic developments that we've all witnessed in Australia, but also elsewhere. So the contestable funding phenomenon that has created a demand-led system with a plethora of choices for young people. We've got a situation now where we have also upward of 4,500 RTOs. We have research and commentary coming out about the effect on the relationships between traditional relationships that you would find in education institutions, what this demand led and marketised system has done to the traditional relationship of an identity of learner, teacher, who now become consumer and provider. And we also see in other research the tension that is becoming apparent between the provision of high quality training and survival in a business setting. So those almost not contending imperatives, but those imperatives that may not sit easily all the time. And finally, we're thinking also of the work that's come out, say, for example, in the Dandolo Partners research that has shown also that there's an unprecedented level of movement across sectors of young people finding themselves in settings that previously we would associate with adult learning, and similarly we have providers who are encountering cohorts that they're unfamiliar with. So this is a global trend, and across those sort of underlying themes, if you like, are tensions and really interesting sort of provocative questions that will sort of inform our analysis, I think. And lastly, interesting times, that's for sure. When we started this about 8 or 10 months ago, well, since we started 8 or 10 months ago, all our Queensland government has changed, our Victorian government has changed, our federal government has changed, and along with that we've seen quite fundamental changes in regulatory arrangements, in standards. We've seen concern about the non-payment of vet fee loans, vet fee help loans, and we've also seen a private sector that's under unprecedented scrutiny. So this is the kind of landscape that we're wandering into, and it's sort of a hang on to your hats kind of research, particularly in terms of the scrutiny of private providers who are now trying to conduct their business with daily headlines of withdrawals of certificates, collapse of major training organisations, Vocational and Evoca, and in a sense a sector that is in some ways besieged. So that's by way of context. That's the kind of research experience in the last year. I'll move on now to finish off the context by just looking at the RTO landscape. So we're focusing on the bottom right hand, on the 3,200 odd, and listening yesterday to Peter Shergold talk about the TVA coming out. I'm wondering how accurate this is now, but and how much it might be revised. But this is the latest figures from training.gov. In terms of the numbers, so again we're focusing on a relatively small amount of young people on the far right hand side. On the far left hand side you'll see all the 15 to 19 year olds in VET, Australia-wide for 450 odd thousand. Early school leavers in VET that don't have year 12, those corresponding figures, those in private VET, and those doing entry-level programs, and they're the ones we're focusing on, the Cert 1s and Cert 2s. And all up, we'll be looking at around about 58,000 kids in those three schools in those three states. Touching on the survey, as I said earlier, it's a very comprehensive survey. It's 32 questions canvassing themes ranging from, of course, the profile of the RTO, the student characteristics, their background, their skill level, their readiness, their barriers faced. We're looking at also the practices of the RTO across engagement and wellbeing support in teaching and learning. We're looking at how they assist and deal with the issues of pathways out of the RTO, nearer to completion, talking about completion, non-completion and partnerships as well. The survey itself has now finished, so we're just, as I said, we've ripped out some findings for this presentation here, but over the coming weeks we'll have a much more comprehensive analysis. And I should say also that the design, it was trialled with ACPET and through NCVER, Georgina's assistance. So it was a tortuous process getting the survey right. By no means perfect, but I think it's it'll serve us quite well. That I'm going to skip because the numbers just don't add up, I discovered in the library just a little earlier. But 180 odd surveys went out and we got a response of 130, which we were really quite pleased about, especially again in the context of a sector who is being under such scrutiny and under threat, if you like. So we were quite pleased that so many would be willing to answer questions about their practices and questions that really did allude to the quality of their provision too. So I think that 130 is quite good. We asked about the trend in their enrolments, and you'll see that about 60-odd% here have either increased slightly or increased significantly their enrolment of those 15 to 19-year-old early school leavers. And the no change there is taken. The decline, I'm wondering whether that might have been affected by changes in subsidy regimes in the various states. We asked them about the challenges faced by their early school leavers. These are quite interesting and in some ways counterintuitive. For example, down the bottom there, I was surprised to see that mental illness and high levels in drug and alcohol use was so little, so small. To me that's counterintuitive because it doesn't really resonate with the feedback that we were getting in conversations with trainers, at least in South Australia and Queensland. I should have said that our Victorian case studies are underway now. So I'm just going to hang on to that, and I also want to hang on to that issue of mental health and anxiety and depression and the like, because they were barriers that featured so prominently in reasons why kids drop out of secondary school. So I'm kind of surprised that they aren't evident, or at least they're not noted by the RTO. We'll see with that one. The top one there too, the Centrelink requirements, is quite interesting. What I didn't get back in my interviews in Queensland, but is coming back from South Australia, is this awareness of the resentment and the from the students at being compelled to be in training, and that's going to be a little bit of a refrain that we'll see through a lot of these. The resume writing and interview skills is not surprising. Unclear learning pathways similarly. Another one that perhaps is surprising is the transport, which again we expected would be higher. A young cohort, we expected that to be higher there. Negative impacts on learning outcomes, so we're narrowing it down here. Those RTOs we spoke to felt that of course, low and limited literacy was a problem. Surprisingly, low and limited ICT skills. I guess it depends on what mode of delivery that RTO had and has. And the disengagement from learning, I guess, also I think is inextricably linked and perhaps another symptom of a kind of resentment kind of a confusion, if you like, of being in a place where often the kids don't want to be. These are some of the text-based responses that we got. And here I'm relying not just on the survey, but some of the transcripts that came from our interviews. Outside influences, alcohol, personal health issues, multiple barriers to engagement, family, socioeconomic barriers that have not been addressed. Now there's a couple of things that come out of this one and that also connect with a kind of a frustration, if you like, on the part of the training organisations at having to deal with and cater and perhaps even remedy issues that are way beyond their control. And this frustration, if you like, is expressed in many ways, but I think it manifests in asking rhetorical questions like, whose responsibility is it? Is it our responsibility? Is it the school's responsibility? Is the family's responsibility? Is the employer's responsibility? Who is supposed to deal with these issues? So that is also a bit of a refrain, and I think it'll be a bit of a constant theme that emerges. More contributing factors to non-completion, boredom and distraction, difficulties extracting meaning from written learner materials. This one here, the second one, students getting behind in their work. In the work that I've done with those who have exited secondary school prematurely, that is just such a profoundly important issue, I think, for any educator to keep an eye on. When a kid starts to fall behind, I'm not a psychologist, there seems to grow a level of resentment and frustration and a inability, unwillingness to catch up. And unless that educator is responsive, unless there are the resources there to enable the young learner to catch up quickly, then it becomes a spiral. It's exacerbated. So I was very interested to see that there, not surprised in a way. As I say, much of this resonates with what we've known from the secondary school setting, what's known there. Again, that last one speaks to the notion of being compelled. This was an interesting one. Again, we've got the kids for 12 or 16 weeks. What ought to be expected of us? Are the expectations of us unrealistic? And especially, we ought to remind ourselves that many of these training organisations are quite small, don't have the infrastructure, don't have the facilities that TAFEs and others do have. But I do like this. We've got them just for a brief period of time. So, what can you expect of us? This table here kind of sums things up. If I was to ask to sort of sum up the barriers to completion, again, underlining the heading there is interrelated. Very rare that it's any one of these issues, but I would say that socioeconomic issues are very, very important. Well-being issues and readiness issues. Running along the bottom there are issues to me that deal with a particular frustration, a disposition, resentment, and issues that really call out for relational responses, trust, support, that isn't necessarily prescribed. We also asked moving on from the barriers and the challenges, we asked what skills the RTOs felt that their trainers needed to address these issues. Again, the relational, the personal, the social skills jump out, empathy, guidance, the ability to provide educational support, patience, a sense of humour, flexibility. And the word patience was sprinkled around throughout these, which is wonderful, isn't it? So I culled most of them, but patience could have gone on forever and ever and ever. What do you make of the 45-year-olds are not respected? Does that resonate with any of your experience here? I'd be interested to know. It jumped out a little bit, and that I guess actually reminded me of an account from one RTO that spoke of how difficult it was for young people to be learning alongside those who were not their same age. So I'm assuming that as a trainer, the same might apply in their relationship with the trainer. More on the skills that trainers need: direct communication, learner-centred teaching, behaviour management crops up frequently. I like this one very much. It speaks very much to a strengths-based approach. What was reported back, the impressions at least from Kitty after doing her South Australian field work, is that she was struck by this sort of deficit approach in describing the young people. They lack this, they lack that, they're flawed in this way, they're flawed in that way. So this one kind of stood out and was quite encouraging, really. Strengths-based, you've got to look for the best in the kid. You've got to show leadership. You've got to be an exemplar, that they respect your expertise, and that they too can become leaders too. How are we travelling? All right? Okay. So how the RTOs were asked, what approaches were most effective in teaching. And the ones that jump out to me here are those that speak to tailored learning, student-centred learning, but also learning that's relevant to their trade. So that is learning that's conducted in the workplace, in situ, alongside their workmates, that's relevant and flexible. This too resonates with what we were hearing from the Queensland people, that block training in a room, 20 kids, is kind of death for a lot of these youngsters. Again, the programs and context, the survey respondents were asked how much they agree with these statements. The importance of trades-based programs, structured workplace learning, the importance of embedded LNL support, higher employer-based training, and that completion is lower for those without year 11. So again, trades-based, very, very important. Structured workplace learning was important, employer-based. So again, the relevance and the immediacy is very important. Support services that the RTOs say are available. Three kinds, we asked them. Those that where an external organisation and support agency was recruited, was brought in to assist the young one. Excuse me. Those where the young person was referred out, and those supports that were a part of the provision. What surprised me here was how little external organisations are brought in my impressions, again, from the field work was that that's not unusual at all, but that's something that we're going to have to work through and unpack a little bit. Referrals out. The supports that are provided in are mainly to do with facilities, mainly to do with amenities, internet access, library, computer facilities, job search support, if you like. Those that were perhaps lacking dealt with issues, those issues that I guess impacted from externally, problems of housing, problems of childcare, if you like, financial counselling, where a young person might be in real strife, but perhaps it's beyond the capacity of the RTO to deal with. Still begs the question, though, why not more resources are brought in from the outside. We did have instances in South Australia where a provider sort of bemoaned the end of funding that used to enable that. I think in the South Australian setting it was the WELL funding, workplace English language. And in the Queensland setting it was the DOORS funding, which is still being accessed, but that mainly for apprentices and trainees. And that enabled, I think that's a Department of Industry pool of funds that enables you to bring mentors in and support of that kind.
That's a national program.
National, yeah, okay. We asked them, the RTOs, what it is about how they see this particular cohort. Coming through very strongly is that the size of the RTO, that's small, is in many ways beautiful. This too resonates with much of what I'd heard elsewhere, that intimate, small settings appeal to kids. And what surprised me some time ago when I was hearing students talk about their first encounters with training organisations is how spooked they often were by the larger institutions, the TAFEs, which in some ways shouldn't surprise us, because I guess if we remember our first days and weeks in university, when we went to university, how alienating that was. So I guess that it's not surprising that the small and intimate settings might appeal. Not a whole lot felt that the early school leavers is their core business, and I'm supposing too that might fluctuate as subsidy regimes change. Engaging with parents was not really so striking. Connecting also to the question of intimacy, I think, was access too, that many small RTOs had students from the vicinity who lived close to them, and that may in fact speak to why the transport issues weren't so striking in that previous graph that we saw earlier. Again, I'm a bit tentative with that stuff, and I think we're going to have to think it through a little bit more. The number of referrals, where do they get their kids from, and JSAs, etc., feature there. And I think that also speaks to, may speak ultimately to that notion of being compelled, and, you know, why a kid is there, when they're there, and how that reverberates, that sort of, how that affects their learning. Okay, so how are we going for time? Okay. This is a fairly clunky table that tries to give you an idea of what we're learning from our field work. So you can see it's incomplete. The Queensland field work has been completed, but not to my satisfaction. I'm going to have to fill in some gaps there. South Australia has been done, except for interviews with system-level stakeholders, people in government and in peak bodies, and the Victorian fieldwork is barely commencing. The RTOs that we spoke to are mainly in hospitality and retail, community services and in auto. Again, those that attract younger people. In teaching and learning, what we've found out there, I think, is much of what we've already spoken about, is that relevance, immediacy, learning in situ is very, very important. The difficulty with language literacy and numeracy skills, screening and support. Now, there's one issue on online learning which jumps out a little bit, which I'm not sure how much to make of it, that there seemed to be an ambivalence with online learning, and I'm not sure whether that's because the students and the kind of qualifications being studied demand interaction, human interaction, relationship building, conversation, trust, and the like, thinking retail, hospitality. Interesting statement too, and again, I don't know how much to make of this, was that some felt that there's a kind of a stigma associated with online learning, and I guess that is evident in a lot of the throwaway comments about the private sector, that it's dismissed, and those that rely on online learning, well, that's just a cheap and dirty way of getting away with training. And I feel that there's an awareness that there's a stigma is too strong a word, but there's an issue there with too much reliance on online learning. Again, that's something that we're going to have to zero in on and unpack a little bit more. Engagement and well-being, again, one thing that really stood out again is that the trainers and people at RTO level are very, very aware that they have this student in a period of development. And a refrain that came through too was that being qualified is not being job ready, that we shouldn't be preoccupied with a certificate, we shouldn't be preoccupied too much with attainment, because the time spent in training is a period of maturation and quite often a turbulent time for the kid. And many of the people who assisted these kids had a very warm, supportive and, what would you call it, not a maternal for the women, what's paternal? Paternal attitude towards the kids. So many of them were saying, look, so much is happening in their lives. They shouldn't be too hung up. We shouldn't be judged so much on completions. We keep telling the kids that, look, if you're in retail now, don't worry about it. This will lead here, there, everywhere. Don't be too fixated on the outcome. So that was a very interesting, and why should it be surprising? Because I guess anyone who's taught would echo that. But I guess we have preconceptions of a for-profit private sector. Again, patience, empathy, accessibility, being intimate and small. Students' expectations, again, RTOs were quick to dampen down in some ways. Students' expectations, let me pause for a moment there. Dampen down, but also in some ways highlight the realities of what they're getting into. That this may well be shitty work that you're getting into, and don't feel as though, don't have such high expectations of us and yourself in this moment in time. We asked RTOs about the context in which they were operating in, the funding regimes. We heard often, I think, that the kind of bizarre fluctuations in subsidising qualifications one moment this qual, next moment the next another qual, made it very, very difficult for them to operate. And I was reminded when I was hearing about this, lamenting the sort of haphazard subsidy system of Lisa Wheelahan's comments on how funding regimes can distort the not just the relationship but the decision making of the provider and the decision making of the learner as well. So the image of a feeding frenzy came to mind when there was heavy subsidies in some courses. Students would flock there, providers would flock there, whether it was the right area to be in or not. So that was quite interesting. Another related issue there is an example, I guess, is in the Queensland setting where subsidies for retail were cut. And I think a quite pertinent comment was that, hey, look, there may not be a shortage of retail assistance, and the country might not need more retail assistance, but this is the very best form of learning for these kids. So if we're looking at the needs and the stage of development for these young people, perhaps retail ought to be subsidised, even though industry is not crying out for it and the country isn't crying out for it. So again, it may be, and I think this also touches with Lisa Wheelahan and John Buchanan stuff that's just come out recently on not being too job specific and perhaps tailoring our education to the learner's stage of development. Now, this has been a real whirlwind tour. Many issues are covered in the rest of the survey. And just to give you a very quick rundown, we're asking the RTOs their mode of delivery. Is it face-to-face? Is it online learning? So we're delving into that. We're learning more about the student characteristics, gender, background, where they live, the nature of the support that they provide with pathways as the student is approaching the completion, what kind of partnerships the RTOs have, not just with employers but with other agencies. We're drilling down a little bit deeper into that. We're asking them about how employers regard their service and what kind of collaborations or relationships they're having with employers, and what factors help or hinder effective transition out. So as I say, we're dealing here in a very perfunctory way in some ways with what we've done so far, but in coming weeks we hope to distill and analyse and bring together so much of what we've done to come to more well-articulated findings. I'm ready for a draft report. Almost. Thanks, folks. Good.
We only have a couple of minutes for questions.
George, so you've already spoke about that, sometimes you have a preconceived notion of what private RTOs are doing and what, they're in it for profit. And you've touched on whose responsibility or the expectations on private RTOs. So really at the end of the day, what do you hope this work will achieve?
What my own inclination is to zero in on the supports, and my own feeling is that we should connect with that system articulation issue, that regardless of where the learner is, there ought to be cross-sector support. So my message, at least the way I'm formulating it now, is that wherever high needs learners are, support has got to find them. And whether that's from the RTO resource by the RTO, the provider ought to have the capacity, they ought to be adept enough to access resources from elsewhere to help the high needs students. So that's perhaps the one that's closest to my heart.
And I guess I asked what would be their compunction to help high needs students. So what is the driver and the pull? Because if they've got to invest a lot of time and energy in one a cohort of students when they can put less time and energy in other types of students and continue on. So what would be that driver, do you think?
I would say that would affect directly on completion rates. Yeah.
And are you also looking at the issue of regionality in any way?
Look, we struggled a little bit with that in the Victorian setting where picking RTOs on the far east and far west of Melbourne, metropolitan mainly, similarly with South Australia, but in the Queensland setting it was mainly Brisbane based. So that's an issue and it's a limitation. Initially I had contemplated travelling throughout regional Queensland, but just the resources didn't extend. Yeah.
All right, well, if you do have anything you'd like to say, feel free to flag on George after the next session. We'll come up. And yeah, thank you very much.
Good on you. Thank you.